Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along to the latest RSS online event. And this one is really looking and focusing on how we go about normalising data sharing and linkage for policy and research. So bear with me just a minute and I will stop sharing. Oops. Perfect. Okay. So the way we're going to run this session is relatively informal. So this is a discussion between three wonderful speakers who have a huge amount of experience and expertise in this particular area. And we'll have the sort of moderated part of the discussion, but there will also be chance for Q&A as we go along. So any burning questions or comments as we go for the speakers, please just pop them in the chat as we go. And we'll either answer them as we go along or we'll save them for the dedicated Q&A at the end. Now, I will ask everybody just to write in the chat for their questions, just because if we have a relatively large group and we start to allow people to unmute and speak, it can get a bit chaotic. So if everybody's happy with that, we will just go on the chat. All right, so let's get going. So the trigger really for this event is the UK Statistics Authority's review by Professor Leavesley, and in particular two recommendations, recommendation 6 and 7, which highlight the importance of efficient data sharing for research and for statistics. And it also talks around the role of the Office for National Statistics Integrated Data Service, or IDS for short. And that's really where we want to start our conversation today. One thing that I always reflect on with these events is how incredibly fortunate we are in the UK to have an almost unlimited palette of data. We're extremely lucky, whether that's survey data, administrative data, what we call here digital behavioural data or social media data. But we know there are still a lot of challenges. There are voices of dissent sometimes around data is hard to find, it's hard to access, it's heavily siloed. So we know that this is an area that we need to continue to work on. So this is where we start today. Now, we're going to focus in this particular session on the IDS and the impact of that and the impact of the Leavesley report. We want to follow up in future meetings, but I'll come back to that right at the end. So for now, what I want to do is I want to turn to each of our three speakers and ask them just to spend a couple of minutes each introducing themselves so that we can get to know you all a little bit better. So I'm going to start with Julian first, if I may.
Great, thank you. I'm Julian McCrea. My current role is Deputy Director for Strategy on the Integrated Data Service. We'll come back to, I'm sure, in the discussion quite a lot about what that means, what the IDS is doing, what the interesting challenges we have, and just making sure we deliver the sort of vision that's set for the IDS, which is getting ready to use data much more rapidly available to researchers and analysts, particularly those working on government policy, but more broadly than that, for research across our society. My background, I actually started working a very long time ago now, about 30 years ago, at a place called the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And I did a lot of work then with what used to count as large data. We had about 7,000 observations from the Family Expenditure Survey, and we used it for our tax and benefit simulation modelling. And the trick was getting something of that size into memory. We spent a lot of time thinking about that. It's a very bygone world now. I think that model runs, it used to run about 30 minutes, it now runs in less than a second. So, you know, world has changed, data has changed. I spent a lot of time in Whitehall working on policy. I worked in a place called Prime Minister's Strategy Unit for a while, and then I moved to a place called the Institute for Government, which thinks about how you join up government, how you do policy making better, how you make things more effective. So essentially, my career has been public policy, use of data in public policy, whether it's actually doing the research, doing the analytics side of policy making processes, or thinking about how we develop policy making to be a more rigorous part of government. There's an old phrase that I love called evidence-based policy making. It's wonderful. Too often, in my experience, you get policy-based evidence making. I suppose my mission in life is to make sure we do the first and not the latter, and we have the tools and data to do that. And really, ultimately, doing that to help people, to improve people's lives, using the power of government to make things better across our society. So that's me in background. I hope that's what you were looking for, Deborah.
Perfect. Thank you, Julian. Emma, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Emma Gordon. I'm director of the ADR UK programme, that's Administrative Data Research UK. And I work at ESRC. And the programme was set up in 2018 to do exactly what Deborah was saying. So normalising data sharing for government data data owners, and supporting them to think how to link that data so that we could carry out and facilitate policy relevant research. So we have 4 trusted research environments, one in each of the 4 UK nations, and it's ONS Secure Research Service that provide the trusted research environment for ADR England. And we've worked with, as I say, government data owners, policymakers and researchers to really co-create this programme of work. Got a fantastic set of linked data sets, that population level linked data sets now available for research use, including a lot from Whitehall government departments. And I think the key for us has been getting the incentives right for data owners to engage, because I think in all our interactions with government civil servants, is not that they don't want to do this, but the benefits, there's always going to be a burden to engaging and cleaning data, submitting data to us. But essentially that burden, the benefits have to outweigh that burden for the government department. So it's about individually working with government departments in the way that they want to work with us. So, you know, they're getting what they need out of this interaction as well. And we're playing back those research outcomes back to them in a way that, you know, is easy to digest. It's not just you know, peer-reviewed journals behind firewalls, for example. But yeah, I've shared a link in the chat to our website. We've done a huge amount of work with all our trusted research environments to improve the transparency around what we do with this data. So we've now got a data catalogue that sits across all 4 trusted research environments, and there's a heck of a lot of public engagement and also training materials on our website. But yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks very much, Deborah.
Thanks, Emma. That's great. So much to digest in all of that. So please go and have a look at the website if you're maybe less familiar about the ADR UK. I mean, I think you've come a long way, and you know, we can talk about this as we go through the conversation. So last but by no means least, Felix, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, so I'm Felix Ritchie. I'm at the University of the West of England, where I direct the Data Research Access and Governance Network. I've got a number of different roles, all connected to the effective use of public sector data for research. So first of all, I'm a researcher. I'm an active researcher myself, so I use confidential research data, both in TREs. I download it, I collect my own data, lots and lots of different projects. Secondly, I'm an analyst of administrative data, so I'm an ADR-funded researcher. I've been working since 2019 on ADR-funded projects. I spent the last year trying to wrestle the HMRC PAYE data into a data set. So that's a year trying to just make basic sense of one single data set. A third, I've set up TREs and advise others on the design and organisation and management of them. As some of you may know, I set up the original SRS back in 2003. I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew what I wanted. And as a result, we got a model which was very different from anything else that's around. And it's now the model on which most UK TREs are based. It was also far and away the most efficient organisation for the facility for the next few years. So nowadays we spend quite a lot of time going into organisations and actually helping them understand what they're doing and carrying out efficiency and governance reviews. Fourthly, and last, I'm a specialist in research data governance. So again, some of you might know I devise a 5 Saves framework, but also all the other stuff that goes into it, such as, staff and research training and output checking and thinking about forms and processes. So I'm here because I've got a good sense of what academic and government researchers want to do their jobs, because I was a government researcher for a while. I know the problems of trying to curate research-ready data from administrative sources, and I also know how to design and run effective data services. So I've also been effectively trying to engage with the IDS at multiple levels over the last year. So that's why, I'm IDS, great ambitions, lovely to see them there, and really good to see where we want to be. But as it stands, there are very, very serious issues with the IDS, and I have quite a lack of confidence in where it's going at the moment, and I think it needs a radical change to make it more effective. On the wider issue of culture, which is my other big bugbear, I've been working for the last 2 years with the ESRC in a report looking at future data services, what we do. Lots and lots of issues, but one of the key issues here goes back to recommendation 6 from the report. It's about the culture, with lots of recommendations on there. The disappointing thing is that I could have made those recommendations 15 years ago. They're exactly the same. Okay, we know what the problems are. We know how to fix it. Why aren't we doing this? And it's partly because of the way we organise our decision-making processes. And I do think this is at the root of some of the IDS's problems, that they're working within a system where fundamentally process is often valued above objectives and achievement from here. So I'm going to throw it out there, see what happens.
Excellent. Okay, so that really gets us off to, a flying start, I think. And perhaps that's the best place to start, is just by discussing a little bit more, we know we have been saying, these things for a while. We know we've been facing the same challenges for a while. And, forward movement is sometimes quite slow, not through lack of, willingness, but sometimes we do face these barriers. And I wonder if that's where we could start. And Emma, I might throw this back to you just as a first off, because, we had a brief discussion last week in this area. Recommendation 6 recognises cultural barriers are at play, but I wonder if you could give us a little bit of your perspective about what these are, and then we can open up and talk about, how do we move beyond this?
Sure, and I think it's at the end of the day, you can have an IDS. It's a absolutely brilliant principle, and the vision is great, the platform is great, the technology is great, but you need to bring people with you as well, and so these systems are never perfect. There's always compromises. You're always trying to balance trade-offs. And when we started the ADI UK programme, it was off the back of a programme called ADRN, Admin Data Research Network, which was closed down early, actually, in 2017. And it was closed down early because although progress was being made in the devolved administrations slowly and steadily on opening up access to administrative data for research use, it fundamentally wasn't shifting the dial at all in Whitehall. And at that point, the only department that was systematically sharing data with researchers was Department for Education with their National People Database. And so it was really kind of, we knew we had to get the culture thing right, and that's why we ended up with this model, which I'm not saying it's perfect by any means, but it's a really, really good stepping stone towards the IDS vision. because we allowed people, departments to work with us in a way that made sense to them. So, for example, you've got Department for Education, DWP, HMRC and HESA. They had already created the Longitudinal Education Outcomes database, but they didn't have a mechanism to share that with researchers. We gave them that through the ONS Secure Research Service, and we didn't put any sort of preconditions on how that service would be managed. We just asked them, we'll work with you in the way that makes sense to you, just to get them on board and working with us and sharing data. And that's been absolutely incredible. Another example, Ministry of Justice, they came knocking on our door and say, we have been trying to make sense of our data, well, tried to get the resource to make sense of our data for 10 years now, and it always drops off the priority list because, you know, MOJ runs a prison service. There's always another priority, much higher priority than sorting out administrative data for research use. And, you know, internal analytical use as well. So we funded the Data First programme, and within 2 years they'd done the major cleaning and all of that messiness that Felix was alluding to around the HMRC data, noting this data was not collected for research purposes. It's just a byproduct of the government systems and services that we run. But we paid MOJ to sort that data out. And steadily over the last few years, they've made all of that, made sense of it, linked it, and made it all available for researchers, and linked to other government department data like DFE. So, you know, it's just about finding what are their pain points, what do they want out of this, and then offering them a solution that fixes out those problems.
That's great. And I think, you know, we have to recognise, you know, the steps forward that have been taken. I mean, I was at the UKDS during the era of the, you know, the ADN, and, you know, so I know a little bit about the pain of trying to push these things forward. I mean, Felix, I don't know whether you want to sort of add to that, and then I'm going to go around to Julian.
Yeah, I mean, I think ADR as the initials. Got ADR UK, yes, right. I'm thinking too many ADRs. Yeah, I mean, this is a good example of actually how government can learn just evidence from actually things around the past. I mean, ADRN had a lot of problems, and one of the things was it put a lot of cost on central government organisations and didn't give them very many incentives. And it wasn't a sustainable model at all. So in terms of trying to change that round, say actually to try and get organisations to think strategically, it's been very effective, and also recognising that this is a costly and expensive thing to do. That's been really effective as well, because to say, well, actually, okay, it does take a lot of time and money to turn this data into usable research-ready data. We shouldn't expect DWP to fund the benefit of that for doing it for researchers. So that's really good. I mean, there are still issues. I mean, they could go a lot further with that, but let's leave that aside. Let's recognise that actually what's happened with ADR, and it's been really good for pushing that forward. But that then now links into what are the problems with the IDS, because the ADR model, data model, is fundamentally incompatible with the IDS model. ADR model is set up, it recognises that to get usable research-ready data from administrative data, you need to curate it. And typically you create it, you curate it. Over time, you create a static data set out of that, and that needs to have ways of updating that, and needs to have metadata and all those other things. The IDS vision of being able to haul stuff off from different government departments, and particularly to have dynamic models of the data as can be being updated, is inconsistent with that. That is a fine model if you start with clean, nice data at the beginning, but there's very little data in government that works that way. And that also doesn't work with the way that we need data for research and analysis, which is actually that it has a provenance. We can say this is the data at that time of what was being used. So this is one of the things where I'm starting to say the problem here is that IDS was set up in a particular way, going down a particular route. And somewhere along the way, someone didn't go back to ADR, and where your discussions are going on now, but they didn't go around and say, well, hang on, why are we putting many millions of pounds into actually investing in creating curated data sets, when we're now putting £100 million into a completely different model, which has a completely different assumption about the type of data. So, yeah, I mean, and I think that comes back, the culture issue on here is not so much that people are not wanting to do the things. I mean, even in the ADRN, people would not turn around and say, well, I'm not going to do this because I don't want to do this. They were always happy, but they were just so many risks and difficulties. Now we've addressed some of those, but what we still haven't got is the idea that we incentivize and structure objectives much more clearly, so we know where we want to be, and we don't take historical models as a guide to what we do. They're evidence about what might work or not. That's not a reason for doing something just because it's done the same way in the past. And this is where we need to get away from this culture of saying, okay, we do things slowly and carefully, and this is what we did before, we'll try and change that. Sorry, it's quite rambling on, so I'll let it on to Julian now.
No,
as I've been very rude about your systems, and I ought to give them a chance to be positive. Sorry.
Well, exactly. So, Julian, big question there for you. I mean, you know, you hear some of these critiques, some of these suggestions. Where do you think we are in terms of the IDS, and how do we go in the right direction? Huge question. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Exactly the one to be asking, I think, in this space. And I was very relieved. Sometimes these panels, everyone agrees with each other on them. And I thought, when listening to Felix, I thought, well, at least we're not going to have one where everyone totally agrees on everything. Though there is a bit that I do agree with in this. So just to take, let me go wide for a second, and then I'll come back into Felix's point on this. So the IDS program, I joined it about 12 months ago. I think it's probably one of the issues here is that it is trying to change an entire infrastructure in one bite. And that's great because that can be really, really powerful. But it also means there are loads of interacting parts which often get in the way of each other. So IDS and ONS is the host organization in which the IDS is being delivered. The lead delivery partner, I think is the official phrasing, is currently running probably the biggest set of data sharing negotiations anyone's ever attempted, certainly simultaneously. And at the heart of what it's trying to do is negotiate as much a set of data sharing agreements, which will mean that the way data is provisioned is really standardized, attached to the Digital Economy Act, and hopefully allow much quicker and easier access for researchers to that, because most of the things will be standardized inside the process by which the data is accessed under the DEA. And come back to that, there's huge amounts of things in that. The second thing the IDS is attempting to do, really this is an ONS-driven piece. It's actually officially not the IDS, but the ONS has been developing for some years the RDMF, which is basically a framework for linking and indexing data, and really trying to create essentially population indexes for people, demographic index, for businesses, building off the IDBR, relatively well-established piece, for addresses as well. So that data, individual data sets can be indexed, linked effectively to one of those indexes, one or more of those indexes, depending on the data. Obviously, anonymized once you've made that linkage. But then once you're linked in against that index, any two data sets can then be rejoined to each other relatively rapidly. Now, sometimes when people talk about this, they pretend it's like, we'll just zip them together, be done, instantly joined. Obviously, the joining of two data sets, even if you've got them linked to a base index, is more complex than that. You're almost certainly going to have, particularly for really important subpopulation, some clerical element to that matching, some probabilistic element as well. But that's the infrastructure side of indexing data. That makes data owners quite worried, because they kind of go, oh, you're just going to join up our data to everything else that's out there. And actually, that could become really quite dangerous for our privacy side. Quite right to be worried about that. So it makes those data sharing negotiations a step more difficult when you're trying to also bring a new way of linking data together. If I can go on, the next bit is probably, Felix, the bit where just should pick up a little bit. IDS is building in the cloud a very, very big data store. Now, that brings a huge amount of security issues with it. The SRS has a huge data store. It's on a set of physical servers, but it is accessible through the cloud. That brings its own worries. The IDS, though, is in scaled servers. It's Google Cloud is the base for it. It's a private cloud, obviously, within Google. And that gives us some huge advantages in scaling. And as admin data is growing bigger and bigger all the time, having that scalability of a cloud basis is really critical for future of infrastructure. One of the things we spent a lot of time on is how do you put the standards of security that we have in our trusted research environments, for which we don't actually trust people in our trusted research environment. We are locking things down within the 5 safes, as Felix alluded to earlier. How do you make that work? How do you bring it about? But also, what data do you put into that store? And this, Felix, is probably one we should talk a little bit about, because actually the vast majority of the data that's in the IDS at the moment is in that format of a static data set donated. It comes with, it's this particular year's of LFS data, it's this data on the census, etc. We do want to have live feeds, and we do have some regularly updated data in there, but it's not a it is not a live linked platform in the way you sort of describe it. So it'd be good to just tease into that and the different needs of the different analytic communities, because some people need stuff that's really up to date, really there, but some people really need a time series really back a couple of decades in which to estimate a set of models, and they need to be able to replicate those results, not have a new flow of data coming in. That means they can't replicate what they've done before. So just really important that we get clear what we're trying to do in that. And just, Deborah, if I'm allowed one more thing, because of the nature of a trusted research environment, that data store is linked to an analytic environment, because we don't let the data out to the analysts free into their systems. It's got to be locked in against the data store. We're building that in the cloud. This is probably the thing that has caused me the most headaches over the last period. Cloud compute is quite fundamentally different in the way we handle security and access to it, to compute inside a normal, even a virtual desktop environment. Putting the security around that, keeping the data safe, means we've actually don't use most of the power of that cloud compute, because we're just, security-wise, we're just not 100% certain where the data goes. Have we always got it 100% within our closed environment? And also with securing a cloud environment, so when you authenticate into it, we can isolate that from the rest of your operating system. Those are huge kind of issues. And that's been, again, another bit of difficulty with all those data sharing negotiations, because all our data, we as ONS have to make sure this is secure, but they themselves have to make sure that what we've done is secure. So you get into another round of complexity there. So that's just to explain. IDS is basically, I see it as 4 huge projects all interlinking: data sharing, data linkage, data storage and provision, and an analytic environment securely attached to that. Each of those interacts, and each of them is a big program almost in itself. So we'll run through, I'm sure, in a bit more detail, but just going back to Felix's point, I hope that we are actually building something that is of more use to that analytic community, and much closer to, well, we're changing the technology and maybe moving some of the indexing much closer to the heritage of what the great work ADR UK has done on getting data, getting government departments happy, comfortable, sharing their data, but also linking their data together across those domains.
Can I?
Yes, yeah, I was going to say, Emma, Felix, if you want to.
Yeah, okay, so 2 quick things. First of all, I agree with the RDMS is a great idea. We've got a project due to be, well, it should have started now, but it's not happening. But but again, we'll be testing that, looking forward. So I mean, if it works, it's a really nice way forward. And that's what I mean about, IDS has lots of really good ideas and ambition. It's the implementation we're struggling with. In terms of the governance framework, actually, you have real problems with governance, partly because you've adopted stuff from the SRS. And the SRS is not particularly good at lots of elements of governance, and it has been getting worse over the time, unfortunately. We can talk about it separately. However, I'm really pleased to hear about static data set, because this is what I've been pushing for, because basically if you have static files, that addresses many of the issues which, the live model is incompatible with the Civil Service Code of Conduct, the GSS Code of Conduct, because you need to have reproducibility and being able to, sort of say, well, this data, this analysis was provided to government, and this is where it came from. Even at COVID, when everything was being done on a daily basis, you still had verification and version control of everything that was going through. So when the chief medical officer is making recommendations, you know exactly what data is always done from. So standard data set, fantastic. And also recognizing that some people need quick data, and maybe actually they don't need to have it as verifiable because it's been done for different purposes. There are lots of things which could be done on here as well, like, for example, addressing ministerial questions. Lots of lovely user models on there. I'm really glad to hear that we're getting the static thing. But the thing is, as long as you can tell me that the static model is the long-term goal and not an intermediate stage, because I understand at the moment it says happen now, but if that's a long-term goal, then that's fantastic, because as you know, also face lots of criticisms from the user environment. If you start moving towards that as your long-term goal, then actually that addresses many of the problems you can get there as well. So I'm quite pleased to hear that.
Emma, I want to just give you a chance to come in with any additional comments, and then I might go back and pick up a couple of points.
Yeah, so it's around this caution of data owners, I think, and the way that we've sort of built trustworthiness with them is, it's partly sort of working with them in the way that they want to work with us, but it's also making sure that we play back the outcomes of the research. So you'll see on our website it's packed full of case studies, essentially, of research outcomes, and we also embed public engagement into everything that we do. And we've got an ADR England public panel now set up so that anyone from ONS, the Stats Authority, or ADR UK can go to that, and this is mirrored. We're just building on the good practice that's been done in our partners in the devolved administrations. They've had these in place for many years now. And we've also set up like user representation panels to inform and advise the Ministry of Justice Data First programme. So I think a lot of, people have talked about this nervousness of data owners. When you can play back what the public's views are actually about the use of this data and reassure them that if you go in this direction, it's okay. This has public support. If you go in that direction, maybe not. But, and it's about building that relationship up over time and being able to evidence that. So a really, really big thing for us is transparency. It's so having a public data catalogue where everybody can see what data is available for research, but also publishing those case studies, because we want to be telling that public good story about, if all of this data remains in government silos, that's missed use of data, and we really want to be countering that with all the great things that can be done with it, if you get the principles of the 5 Safe embedded into how you set up your trusted research environment and everything.
I think there's a couple of interesting points which are coming up, but one of the things that perhaps we should talk about a little bit is, I get a sense from some of the comments, some of the conversation, and from talking to researchers, colleagues, friends that are still in the UK, there is a sense that there is some disinformation or lack of understanding about what are we trying to do here? What are we actually achieving? And this is something that was also picked up in the review, particularly in recommendation 7, which talks about the fact that the scope and the purpose of the IDS has to be clearly communicated. And I'm just wondering, how well do you think we're doing in terms of communicating? Julian, I can see you want to go.
I think I probably should, to preempt maybe slightly, given I'm responsible for this. So yes, I mean, look, Liverpool Review picked up on the communication about the purpose of the IDS. And I think that was a fair comment, and possibly still is a fair comment, because we have quite a bit of work to do about, as I say, clarifying the scale of what we're trying to do, but also bringing this back to some simple points of principle. One of the issues with the IDS is it was envisaged as performing really 2 functions, which are quite related, but it never, I think, managed to communicate that properly. So the actual IDS itself comes out of internal government sharing. So that Emma was talking about this, we've got all that data in our silos inside government, we actually don't have a lot of that data linked across and used in policy processes within government. Now, some of that is because the data is just very, very complex. And when you're working in a live policy process, you really don't have time to go back to raw data, clean it, do all the things that get into a research ready format. And even some of the research ready format data is probably too complex to really use in those processes, because it still, takes a lot of experience and it takes a lot of time to do work with data. There'll be loads of people in this call who know exactly what I mean in that space. So government itself, government analysts in their policy process have seldom used the type of data we've got inside the SRS or the other trusted research environments. And they've seldom had it linked across data. Now, there are exceptions. DWP is fairly much an exception. It's got a very big analytic capability, HMRC similarly, and they share data themselves. If I look at people like the newly renamed MHCLG, going back to its previous title, for DLUC, for anyone who hasn't quite caught up with our government department in naming, I think because MHCLG has relatively little data of its own, it's always found it more difficult to negotiate those data shares. And it's one of the things that I'd observe. Departments themselves who have loads of data tend, and interest aligned, tend to be able to negotiate with other departments to share data, but that doesn't mean the whole of government gets it. So IDS had that one first bit. How does it help government analysts to access their data? It then, of course, the SRS has been around. I mean, Felix will know much more about the SRS than me over its history and things like that, but it's been around for those 20 years. It will almost certainly does need to move to different technology as it moves forward. So that was kind of wrapped in to the IDS. And then I think for far too long, there was this sort of government user versus SRS user in inverted commas, even though the SRS is used by quite a few people in government. And then data scientist versus social scientist. And some people on this call will know about the tooling sort of stuff and whether Stata would be inside IDS or not. Something I spent a lot of time telling people that you must have Stata in there. R is not a substitute for Stata as an analytic environment. But anyway, that's another sideline we can go down. Those different things, I think, should never have been set up as opposites. And Emma and I have had this conversation on many occasions. An infrastructure that gives you the ability to get access to relatively raw cuts of the data, indexed so they can be linked by people who can actually handle the complexity of what they're doing with that, producing data assets which are fully replicable and actually against a code base, because it is a code-based structure, whether it's Stata or R or something like that. So you can replicate how you got to those more easily usable pieces of data, but then being able to take that data and those processes into government processes themselves, all within the same platform, and potentially with the government analysts and academics being actually inside the same project space when they're working on the same data. That, to my mind, is what the infrastructure should be aiming for here. And we link those two together. Unfortunately, we haven't got that communication right. And Felix has alluded to it. Some of the processes of the IDS are far too close. And so my colleagues who run the SRS aren't here. So I don't want to sound like I'm being critical of the SRS. It has done huge amounts of great work has been done on there. It's grown. But some of those processes really aren't fit for particularly government analysts, but actually all the elements that annoy government analysts are things that frustrate researchers, and they're not there to give us the fundamental security elements, because they can't compromise on the security going back to the public side. So there's a set of things and a set of conversations. They're probably being too slow to get off the ground. And I don't want to do too much here because I always scare people who've got data on the platform, but you're going to give away our data, you're going to remove all the security. And that's not what we're saying. But we are saying there are various things that we think can be done which preserve all the properties that you need in a proper regulated environment, but make it just easier for users to access that data, and actually data owners to know that their data is being accessed and used well. So I've covered a lot of ground there. Your point was fundamentally about communications. I probably confused the communication somewhat, but IDS is there so we can take very complex data, make sure it's linked to get its full value, and then make it available to as wide a research and analytic community as possible within the confines of public acceptability for how their data is going to be used. So that's what we're up to.
Just a small job then,
And hence why, if we may come back to some of the practicalities, a lot of stuff in that doesn't go as swimmingly as you might think, and they're all interconnected. So there are many challenges in making that happen.
Can I just come in on one of those challenges that's a little bit hidden, but it also comes back to this, what you were saying, Deborah, at the start of your question around in the UK, there's quite a lot of negative sentiment about use of data. And I think it's fair to say that that's largely come from privacy lobbyists on the health side. And I personally think it's also related to the fact that if you want access to health data in England, you have to rely on the Health and Social Care Act 2012. And that act is set up so that researchers can get access to data, but it assumes that researchers want and need access to identifiable personal data. And that was very much the old model, because that's what you needed if you were doing the linkage yourself. In the trusted research environment model that ADI UK uses and ONS uses in IDS as well, it's the institution that does that linkage, and it's the institution only that needs access to that identifiable information. And the Digital Economy Act has been fantastic at being used as a permissive legal gateway over multiple government departments for access. And that's how we opened up access to Leo data, for example. That wouldn't have happened without that Act of Parliament. However, in the Digital Economy Act, there is some wording, and I understand why it's there. It was all because of nervousness from MPs at the time that bill was going through Parliament in 2017, around nervousness that around health bodies being able to use that as a mechanism for giving access to data. So we have this really clunky scenario where there's a lot of public good being done on linked administrative data from government, but to link in health data is one monumental challenge. And we've managed to do it in the eChild data set, and you can find out all about that on our website. But one of the things that ONS has been able to put on the integrated data service is a huge amount of health data that they acquired for statistics purposes. Now, if they were allowed through a change in the Digital Economy Act to repurpose that for research use, then, oh my Lord, suddenly things like all of that data first data on crime and justice, if you were able to link in health data so you could get a true picture of the huge proportion of prisoners that when they go into prison have a mental health condition, then we can start actually trying to fix those things. So, you know, we're not potentially criminalizing a lack of access to mental health services, for example, discuss. But, you know, there's a huge amount of data sets that ADI UK has invested in that would really benefit from being able to link in that health data. And if the IDS model works, then and the Digital Economy Act was updated, then, you know, huge amount of public benefit could be done on that research.
It's a really good point. But actually, Felix, can I just pick up quickly on this and then connect it? But and you're quite right. We have quite a bit of health data on the IDS. It is only usable by ONS researchers because of the legal gateways it's come through. So it's not actually even usable by NHS England researchers in that context, which is somewhat ironic. And there's a set of, and this will take us a while, and we need to go through some of the public acceptability testing on this. But there are discussions going on with NHS England about, can we use the ONS as a basis for starting to do some very careful linkage of health data with other data, and then really focus that in, because the benefits to our society of just really understanding what helps people maintain a job, that helps them stay out of needing health treatment, what helps people get back into stable employment, what helps people support others and people who are doing caring for others, and how does that look and how does that play? These are all vital issues, and they all relate back to many of the new government's missions that it's sort of setting up. Essentially, it's a government that needs to understand how it can do some of the preventative stuff in really deep ways and what really works. And we have that data there. We just have to make sure we move at the pace of public acceptability, particularly with health data, as to how it can be used. The ONS can do this partly because it came out of some of the COVID stuff, which loosened up some stuff because we really needed that. But it needs to be properly embedded and properly done. So there is huge potential there. And I'd hope it will be within a reasonable timescale, because there's a lot of momentum behind getting this done. But it's not the type of thing that we can suddenly just switch on. We've got to bring people, as Emma's constantly emphasizing, we've got to bring people with us. Sorry, Felix, you wanted to come in.
No, that's fine. Okay. So just dealing first with the medics and the health bit. I mean, I'm not going to say about the issues of linking there. I mean, what I will point out is that, I mean, medicine, the health research and social science research, between them, that's pretty much all of the confidential data research. So when you got those two disciplines together, what happens there is what determines the others. Other groups have confidential data, but these are the two big fields. There's quite a big difference between the two. I'm very clear is that generally social science is far too closed in the way that it governs things. Health research, on the other hand, is quite often far too open. There are different procedures in there. So there are some really good examples of really good, tight, sort of health procedures. But as a data governance specialist, I have a lot more concerns about what's being done in health than in social sciences, and social sciences is the other way around. That should be the easier question to deal with, because if you're too tight and relaxing, that improves the access to the data. In health, we have too few controls quite often, but bringing those controls back in, it's going to restrict access potentially, and so that's a difficult question to have. So there are also cultural differences between the two groups as well. So I mean, that's why things like the e-chart is really good, because it gets people to see that actually you can make your health data available in a really well-organized way, maybe a too organized way, but at least a really well organized, secure environment, and people can actually use it still. So that's a really nice example. There are other areas where things are being picked up in health from the social sciences. So going back to the original communication issue, there's a question on here, the public support, there's enough studies that have been done by all sorts of different groups. Public is overwhelmingly in support of this sort of public research. It sees it as public asset. Things like the 5 states are really handy for explaining things to the public. They really like this simple concept. So yeah, we know that the public is really supportive of using this data for research purposes, so that's fine. Communications issues around the ISDS have been rather different. First of all, there are some issues with the data owners, because I think data owners share some of our researchers' confusion about these things, and I'm sure they tell you it's all great, wonderful, but I've also spent the last 2 years interviewing data owners as well, and they're a lot more circumspect. I mean, they play along with the IDS because it's the only game in town. Nothing else can happen. This is one of the problems of the funding model, but they're a bit more cautious about these things, and that's partly also getting feedback from the users. And this was the big issue. I mean, you mentioned about SATA. When I was first told about the IDS and shown some initial plans, it must have been 2 or 3 years ago. And one of the things they were saying, well, there won't be any SATA, we'll get people to use R. And I said, then that won't work. That's the biggest user group amongst your social scientists. And it's taken 2 years and a lot of input and complaints from organizations to actually do this. And we're still even not at the stage. I'm on the SATA testing group, but we're still waiting to actually be able to test it. And that's been 3-4 months now. So this comes back to the issue about the user community. I mean, I said I'm very happy about the static stuff. What's been missing, though, is any idea of the user model. So I engage with the IDS on a regular basis. That I'm on some of their panels. They keep bringing them up and ask me for my opinion about these things, and I keep explaining over and again how we do things and how things work. And although we said, we talked about the data analyst, and that's been very much the view. So we had one of the sessions with your engagement team where there's a bunch of us researchers in the room, put up a list of all the software. Great. Okay. We don't use any of the software on here. We don't even recognize a large part of it because it's been designed by someone for a different group. Okay, it's fine. Maybe the data scientists who are doing live geographical stuff. I mean, lots of the stuff was geographical information systems, which my colleagues and things, or the ones I work with, don't tend to use. So that's fine. But what about all the other community? And this has been the big problem, is trying to get a user model. And I've been trying to find someone in IDS who will say, actually, what is your user model? Can you actually tell me and sit down? And we thought we got as far as actually going through this because we've got different user models, 2 of which are based on the ADR group. So the PAYE is a real test for the IDS, because that's the sort of thing which you're going to need to do if you want to link ADR and IDS together, these 2 massive investments. We're also going to try and work on the RDMF one as well, and a simple case. But I haven't seen any user models at all. And the thing is, IDS is the way it's being designed. I suspect that actually your models are not ambitious enough. As well as having got this sort of group of people doing live analysis, you've designed for them, you've forgotten about the big bulk of researchers at the moment, and you also have potentially a lot of stuff that is not being done, like, for example, ministerial questions about live tabulations, other remote job servers. There are lots and lots of things. Once you start from the basis of this is how we're going to get our data in, and we're going to be able to put it from there, we're going to be able to link it and either create live or static data sets from there. Let's think about now the user models, and this is where I'm coming back to. It's that objective that's not there. A comment to put in earlier was about, unfortunately, the amount of money that's being put into IDS is a problem, because it was designed 2 or 3 years ago. It goes through gateway reviews. At each gateway review saying, this is what you're going to do. Have you done it? Yes. Okay, then we'll give some more money. And so that means it's really, really difficult, because I think IDS needs quite a substantial change of view on there. And the decision-making process for funding really make it difficult. So that's where the communication has fell down. And I think that may be why I'm getting negative feedback from the data owners, is because they're hearing it from researchers and UNAs saying, well, we don't know what's going on there.
Should I come back on that?
Oh, yeah, Julian, go.
Very good. Look, the first thing is there's a lot of truth in that base set of points. I don't think the communication engagement for IDS with key user groups has been good enough, but I also don't think some of the user research that it was initially based on was in the right place. I mean, Felix, you mentioned it as a starting point. User research that said we don't need Stata, everyone will be fine without it, was never a good piece of user research. Now, that was redone last year when people went out, and actually I think a very good piece of work was done, which internally said, look, these are not substitutes. You have to make up your mind what you're going to do. And then that went into a lot of how do we get Stata to run, because Stata does not have a web native version to it. How do we get it to run within that environment? How do we get it to run in that environment securely? And Felix, you'll be aware there's the trial version that was tested at the start of this year, which gives access. I won't go into too much detail on this because I know huge amounts about it. The issue now with the latest version, that is the live version, is we just have to get users through the security of creating something that's slightly outside the normal pattern of cloud without it being such a painful security journey that you have to go through that you don't bother to do it. So that's the issue that we've got at the minute, just full transparency on that. We're working our way through it. But the principle of that, understanding those social science researchers, is, I hope, stronger now. It's not perfect, and there are some groups we know we can't satisfy. So SPSS users, we cannot figure a way to get SPSS onto the IDS. It's quite a fundamental thing for some groups. What's the alternative for that? And actually, if you look at SPSS user groups, it generally is to move to R, but that's not a trivial transfer. That's a really, really big transfer. So there's a lot of stuff about support and things for that. But essentially, we are deprecating one platform and bringing in another. There is a change penalty for everybody when that occurs. We can't minimize the whole of it, but I hope we are on top of most of the issues. There's others I could talk about in that for that different user groups. So Microsoft SQL Server Studio, for example, is one of our big things, Management Studio, how we get that into the GCP environment, which we're doing some testing on at the moment. The other group that actually we haven't done much work on, it's always ironic in these sort of circumstances that the perception is we were doing something over here when really we were doing something over there. We haven't done much work on that government analyst group, particularly those high, really fast turnover pieces. And that's something we did earlier this year. We've done quite a lot of work with government analysts to think about what does a space look like for those processes which do not need, and indeed would never be safe or ethical or possible to use row level data in its raw form. So we're doing quite a lot of work. I alluded to it earlier. I almost sort of think about the IDS as almost a data factory here. of how you get from very complex data to stuff that can be really easily cross-tabbed and only has really clear data in it, so you know exactly this is actually what you think this variable is, because that's usually one of the big problems with admin data. You think a variable is saying something, but actually it's saying something completely different to what it looks like. That could be used much more rapidly and accessed much more rapidly within government, and potentially, if data owners agreed, outside government, because those aggregated data sets would be quite useful for people in many walks of life who want to quickly look at what's happening across things. So we're not there yet. And you're quite right that there's a big issue of having not understood user base. I'm afraid the program told people they should behave in a way that fit with what it was building, rather than it's got to build things that people themselves use in their root ways. That's definitely true, and Denise picked up on it and heard it a lot of times, I suspect, in her interviews. That's something we're committing to change. We haven't totally got there, though. I'm interested, Emma, we've been doing quite a lot of work with academic community and doing some of the SRS transition. There's still, it's a pain, it will be painful for people, but we have prioritized the full commitment to continuity of research, so we won't endanger access to existing data sets, and bringing people across when the platform is ready, which some people will have seen the latest communication. For the reasons I alluded to with things like that data, we haven't got in the space we wanted it to be. It didn't get through its user testing. We've not gone and said, well, let's just keep going and force users to take the pain of that. We've said, okay, we need to pause. We need to take a little bit more time to get this into a space that will work. I hope that's what we're going to be able to do, and I hope we'll communicate that to people properly. I'm going to stop talking now because I've covered a huge amount of ground and Felix want to come in. But I'm conscious I haven't talked about your funding model question, which I think is a really interesting one, actually. Just rattled on too long, I think. So I'll pause there.
Okay, so coming back to that, I mean, this is the issue, though, is we don't have those clear user models, but that surely is what drives everything else. When I mentioned about setting up the SRS, I had no idea. They said, here's some data, let's industrialize a process, because at the moment we give our friends access to come and sit in a corner and work on the data. But okay, this is what I want. No idea about the technology or anything else or legal stuff, but this is what I want. How do I do this? And that is what's, I get very much strongly the impression from IDS that it's the technological things. Is we could put on these data, and then what we do with it is what's driving this. And unfortunately, I think you said, it's been very clear that there are lots of different user models. For this amount of money, we really need to be thinking about how those user models work. Because there are also other models. Bringing this data, why don't you allow live tabulation for the public on there? Think about this. So I think the problem is because you have the idea that this is a complete flow, that's where the difficulties come in. And that's why you're trying to fit users into this. Whereas you say, okay, what we do is IDS is your data. I can't remember how you described it, but it's your data collection system. That's fine. Okay, by the way, from IDS, we dump a data set and then we stick SRS on front of it. Okay, that's our system, which we know it already works. That deals with a whole bunch of those users for now. Let's make the SRS a bit more efficient because it could, but that works now. And meantime, we can go on with exploring some of these other things because these other things also have a lot of implications. You don't have an output checking process at the moment. Folks, I've been working with your teams in the current plan say, well, let's wait and see what the ONS does, but that implies IDS works like the SRS. There are different models on here. If you want to do more live tabulation, you need quite different output checking processes and things on here. All of those things need to be integrated together. So I think if you could separate off the user model and say, okay, let's be clear, and that would really help with the communication as well, because you then say, okay, well, actually, here's my scenario. You are Joe Public. You want to do this. You are Joanna, government researcher. You want to do this. This is how it's going to work and fit for you. And these might be some of the compromises people need because, it's a whizzy new system. We can't necessarily have it doing everything, but we should be very clear about all the major things that are there will be there. So I would plead to say, can we have a pause and read a really clear view of where you want to be in terms of model, even if some of them are very long distance models. Where do you want to be and what could this fantastic data store? That's all great. But how is that going to be used over there? And hopefully all the work that's been done to build the technology stays, but you just need to find a different way to link them together. I
want to just give Emma a chance to come in as well from maybe the ADR UK. Sorry, slipping into the old days there. And I want to circle back to the users and researchers in a little bit, but Emma, I don't know if you wanted to come in.
Yeah, well, I wanted to come in actually on the users actually, because, you know, as I keep reminding everyone at ONS, and obviously the SRS teams understand this, but, you know, I'm sitting in the Economic and Social Research Council, not the Data Science Research Council, and I'm negotiating on behalf of the social and economic researchers in academia about what this future service should look like. And in my head, you know, I'm thinking about all of those people who have done sociology degrees, psychology degrees, and I want them to be able to use this service. I don't want it to be so technologically removed from their own experience that hurdle that they have to jump over to get access to it, and the learning that they have to do is too great. And so I can absolutely see that, you know, as I said earlier, the SRS is an actually really useful stepping stone. You know, we can get people using the smaller data sets on the SRS with all of the tooling provision that's on there, and no real limitation on which statistical packages you use, because a full range is there. And then, you know, they build up their skills over the time, and if they want to be analyzing these huge population level linked data sets, which we do want people to be using, if the best place for those long term is the integrated data service, absolutely fine, bring it on. But, you know, let's have a model that doesn't cut out a user base halfway through their journey for becoming, you know, the next generation of quantitative researchers.
Thanks, Emma. I think that's a really important point. And, you know, listening to the discussion, it's, you know, are we trying to do too much? Are we trying to be all things to all people? Which is a fabulous ambition. But is it possible? It's a big question, but is it possible to be all things to all people in one hub?
I think that's a very good question inside this, and you've got to, in your prioritization, you've got to choose. I won't go back over user personas and people we're targeting. I think we're in a stronger position than Felix thinks, but then that probably would reflect both of our viewpoints on this. I probably would always think that. But the fundamental piece I outlined at the start, the four big things that are inside the program: the data sharing negotiations, the indexing. We should come back to indexing incidentally, because I agree with Felix's comment in the chat. RDMF is there, but it's not fully tested yet, and it will take a long time. That's an infrastructure build over a number of years, but it does actually, it works, but not fully tested. The data store, which I think is actually quite interesting. There's a lot of people who would be, well, should you have a data store at all? Shouldn't we link on the fly between stuff and we don't create one big repository? I think government is quite a way off having the capability to do that in its own, the systems of each of the departments to actually do that on the fly linkage, but it probably is where you would go eventually. The bit we've been talking most about is the analytic environment. And I kind of said this at the start, that I think that's been the most difficult bit for us, because cloud compute works in a very different way to sort of a desktop, even the virtual environment desktop environment. And it does tend to end up being aligned with, well, data scientists use these really big environments, which is partly true. It's not 100% true, but it is partly true. And we have taken the design principle that we have to keep that cloud scalability and analysis as well as in storage within this platform. If we'd have jumped that, would have made our lives a lot easier. But it seems to me that you wouldn't make this investment and get rid of that, because that's kind of critical to a future path. And I am sympathetic to some of the comments about, you know, well, we've got other platforms that work for other types of data and other user groups. Do we need to say that everything is inside the IDS? And we're working that way. I mean, there are budgetary reasons and reasons why you may not want to support 2 live systems in the SRS and the IDS at the simultaneous time. But actually, we've committed to that for a pretty fair length of time now, up to at least March 2026. We will dual run both those systems because the transition was going to be too abrupt and too difficult for people to make. So there are kind of things that we are building into this, and the endpoint is definitely a scalable system for the type of administrative data linked across government. That's got to be the core of what we're doing. It's where the new value is. It is, as we discussed, health data linked to some other employment benefits data and things like that. It gives you so many rich insights that the public, as Felix has said in the chat, supports us doing, so long as we're going to protect privacy inside that space. The question then that Emma's raising of, you can get ONS surveys are available on the SRS and the IDS. I mean, the IDS has been great actually at opening up ONS data. We've basically put pretty much every piece of useful data from the ONS side onto it because it was based in the ONS. Part of me thinks we should now move it across to DWP, and DWP will go, oh, it's ours, so we'll put all our data on there or something along those lines. But that stuff can be provisioned in other ways and other platforms, and indeed is provisioned in other ways and through other platforms. Often, though, still those ways have biases inside them that if you're already inside the circle, you get much more privileged access to than the researcher in a university who's got a really great idea to do something. So I think the one thing that I always have in my mind on these discussions, they're not easy discussions, but the wider research community probably wants the IDS staying in that space of it's there to provision that entire community. Because the danger I would see if the IDS became solely it's about government users for their purposes and maybe a small circle of researchers who are very close to that government, government in small g sense of the word, the provisioning, the help and the support and the long run transition to that really rich admin data might be more difficult if there were 2 sort of bases for this. So I fully recognize everything that Emma and Felix are saying about, is this trying to be too much to everybody for every type of data all the time? I think that's a fair critique. But the core of where you're going has to be about that scaled admin data linked across. And how does that get used successfully in different analytic points, right the way through data usage from the really raw stuff, right the way through to the very quick crosstabs, but you can't actually produce the data set that you run the crosstabs on if you haven't linked that data in the background and processed it through in a reproducible analytic path pipeline or whatever we now call being able to actually replicate your results.
Okay, cool. I'm just, Felix, before do you want to come in with a relatively quick point? I'm conscious of time and we have a couple of participant questions that I want to make sure we get to.
I'll try to be quick. So user personas, the reason I have less confidence because we haven't seen them. And even after having one discussion, we said we've created a new research persona, not told what was in there. So that's one of the issues where I don't have confidence. And also when I've had part of the engagement, then the team who's been interviewing me has been surprised about what we do in such basic stuff as researchers create intermediate files. They create temporary files. That wasn't something that was planned to be able to be done. On the SRS versus the IDS and keeping them both going, then that seems problematic only if they're doing the same thing. But if, on the other hand, you SRS or something as being the user front end to keep that going while the IDS gets on with all the data putting together, then they're actually funding 2 different things, doing different things. So it does make it easier to sort of make the financial case for that. On the fly linkage might be useful for some. Overwhelming, though, for anything, even if it's really quick analysis, you still want to have curated, verifiable data sets, and that's part of the GSS code of practice. And finally, the last thing is about this. If you think about IDS being one thing, how are you going to make that data available to other facilities? Because there are other DEA accredited facilities all throughout the UK. There's the UK Data Archive, there's other things. Now, again, if you imagine the IDS as being the data store, perhaps which also provides some user facilities, but also which supports DEA facilities, then that also means that, for example, you can supply files as ONS currently does, the UK Data Archive, who can then take a lot of the user burden, and they're used to talking to academic researchers. So you could end up with, say, IDSs for government users because we've given the data to UK Data Archive to deal with the academic users. So this is, again, user models. How is it going to work? And separating off the idea about the users from the data creation, because what you're saying on the data stuff, is sounding quite good on here. But I think it's that user side which is what's giving you all your problems.
Pesky users, eh? Always the way.
All right. So if we can just go to a couple of questions, because I mean the time has just disappeared really, really quickly as I expected. So I'm going to throw a couple of questions from the participants. I'm going to go in order that they were posed just for ease of reading. So the first question goes back to the loosely review, which says the board should have fewer meetings with updates and do more deep dives. What are our thoughts about that? Are deep dives the right way to go in order to improve governance? Or do we need something else?
I think that's probably the UKSA board that recommendation is about. But if someone wants to correct me, I think it's Tom. I might have that wrong. I don't think it was the IDS program board or anything along those lines. So I wouldn't want to comment for the UKSA board, but I do think in general, deep dives are having boards which understand as a general governance point that get into the meat of something through meeting in slightly different formats to traditional is generally seen as a good thing.
I think you're right there, Julian. My memory of that part of the report was that the Stats Authority hadn't had enough oversight of IDS actually and IDP, and they were only getting kind of snapshot updates, if you like, and therefore deep dives where the Stats Authority board were able to kind of really properly understand what it was about, where the bottlenecks were, and all the rest of it would be more useful. I don't think it was referring to the IDP board, which I sit on, and yeah, I don't recognise that comment.
Perfect. Okay, then moving on. Emma, I'm going to throw this to you first. So this is a question which says, alluding to something you said earlier on transparency and presenting results. What can we put in place to mitigate misuse of access to data? And they've given a context. So occasionally in health or medical research, some early career researchers want to do a small project using data from registries. Most of them are usually very good at preparing their results, but in rare events, researchers move to a different organisation, and everybody else lost interest, hence no analysis is done. What can we do about misuse?
So I think I would categorize this as misuse, not misuse. If you get the difference, yeah. And I think this is where I was saying if health data was treated the same as every other government administrative data set, and that data was held in something like the ONS Secure Research Service or the Integrated Data Service or UK Data Archive, wherever, if it could be treated in the same way, then people can move organisations, but the data doesn't move. You just update your details, and so that's exactly that point I was trying to make actually. That I think health researchers having to rely on this much older piece of legislation is actually hindering a lot of really good research that could be done with that data, because the data is held on a server within a university rather than in a trusted research environment.
And there's also less accurate. I mean, we know about medical training, but medical training focuses very strongly on ethics and about appropriate use of the data. This is why I'm saying it's much more open. It's a bit poor, and it's a good chap's model of data governance, and so that's But for all data services, there is this issue. You give someone access to data, what happens if they lose interest or job something? It is a problem. But I don't think that that's anything to do with the IDS or anything. It's generic. It's the nature of how people use things.
Yes, but I do think there are issues about timeliness by which we can accredit various things, which sometimes, and one of the things we're trying to do with data owners, obviously one of the things that data owners always want is permission to check, well, not always, but the most sensitive data, owners of the most sensitive data usually want to check that their data is being used in a project that they think is suitable for that. What we've been trying to do is streamline a lot of those approval processes because they're not the core business of the department. Quite often it has to go to 2 or 3 different people to check the legal, the ethics, the analytics side. Things can get lost in those chains quite easily. So part of that negotiation, data sharing negotiations that we try and do has been to say, can we streamline this? Can we make sure there's one person in the department? They might want to go and check everything, but when it's standard applications coming through that you've seen time and again, they'll have the power to just approve those. So there are some things that cut some of those timelines from people putting in an interesting piece of research, but then world has moved on by the time they finally get granted permission to do it.
That's something that we hear quite a lot of.
Okay, can I just come in on that? And it was a really, really big moment for the ADI UK programme when we launched our first PhD cohort. So we're funding 20 PhD students across the UK to use our flagship linked data sets from all 4 corners of the UK. And we held off doing it for quite a few years just because we knew that these researchers are the ones that you absolutely want to make sure that nothing's going to go wrong with this data, or and that they are given relatively quick access to the data once a project is approved and everything, because it's really, really time sensitive. But those researchers are now on board. Most of them, some of them are doing integrated master's programs, but the vast majority of them are towards the end of their first year of their PhD, and they're all having a really, really positive time, and it massive relief to us all that we've been able to sort of pull that off, because that's the next generation of researchers for academia, for the civil service, for private organizations. They're really, really important to us.
That's a huge milestone, I think. That's great to hear. So we have one last question, and then I think probably we will just have time for everybody just to have a couple of minutes each just to sort of give a little summary statement before I have just a tiny bit of housekeeping at the end. So the last question is related to COVID and the pandemic, and we've got through nearly an hour and a half without mentioning the pandemic, which is quite unusual. So the question is, we haven't talked a great deal about that yet, but the pandemic clarified a lot of real use cases for relatively complex analysis for directly informing policy, including TREs like the SRS and others. Has the pandemic helped inform or accelerate design of infrastructure going forward? Felix, you are jumping to get in.
I am, yes. Again, the point I was making about CMO was in this context of verifiable data sets. So, I mean, the thing is, even at the pandemic, we're having to get continual updates, daily or twice daily updates of these things from live data sets, putting information in. But even then we're saying, okay, yes, but that's it. This is the data set at 9:40 on a Monday morning that was used to generate this report. That's why it was so important to be able to say, actually, let's live is not good. Static, even if static but very, very frequent, that's good, and that's much more important. And actually, that showed the importance of this model, and that's why I'm less enthused by the idea of anything live, because I'm trying to think why you'd want something really, really live from here, as opposed to something that was 2 hours old and at least curated and verified. The other thing is that it made a big difference was a lot of organizations changed their access routes. Now, some organizations just shut down because they didn't have the ability or options to change things down. Other organisations, for example, ONS or UK Data Archive, were able to move very quickly to home access. Now, this is something which I've been advocating for a long time, but people will say, well, it's a problem, it's a difficulty, you do these things. Pandemic comes along, okay, it's all home access. And now some people are trying to row back from that. But the thing is, we've been doing it for 4 years now, and the world hasn't ended despite pandemic's best efforts. Unfortunately, this is one of the things in data governance. People always think of the bad sides, and they don't tend to often make big decisions until you get a crisis. And there's quite a lot of government decision making. You don't make a decision until you're forced to make a decision if you don't want to make that decision. So what we're trying to do now at the moment, for example, in future data services, one of the recommendations is that home access should be made the default for all data, so that you can work from your home location, get access to all the data sets. And if a data owner doesn't want to give that, right, you can give the reason why you think that home access isn't inappropriate for this, rather than the person wanting home access having to justify their response to you. I think that this is what we're trying to push through, and that's that culture change which Denise was talking about in her recommendation 6, is thinking, well, actually, why should people have to justify that they want to use these perfectly secure services? They're fully trained researchers, in this particular environments, from someone else thinks, well, yeah, I'm not sure about this, I better say no. Let's turn it around. Let's say the one who says, I think I better say no. So actually, what exactly is the concern that you have? Because when we do that, we find time and time again, the concerns go away. Mm-hmm. So we did get some useful things come out of that. It helped change a lot of perceptions on here. It was really good in terms of getting health and social science to link together, which has been very good for both disciplines, because we could take some good things from health about, sort of wider the value of data. We can take stuff from social science about the governance of data. But it'd be really, really nice in the future if we could actually make decisions based upon logic and evidence, rather than having to wait for a crisis to force us to make those decisions.
It would be nice to avoid the crisis in the future. Yeah. Emma.
Could I just come in on that as well? I think as well as the access thing, which, yes, that ONS stood up remote access within 2 weeks, because they realised that all of the government analysts and researchers that were supporting the government with the informing decisions around the pandemic, they all needed to be able to access this data that was on the secure research service. But one of the other really brilliant things was it brought the medical research world much closer to the social sciences research world. So with the COVID infection survey and wastewater testing, and the a million other test and trace data, they were all made available through the ONS Secure Research Service, because that platform was already funded, already staffed and maintained, and didn't matter whether it was social science or health data. The principles were all there, and it worked for both. And so that deep understanding of the social sciences model of how you give access to secure data and sharing that with the medical research world has been really, really beneficial. And I really hope we don't lose that.
Yeah, I think perfectly said. We have literally 3 minutes left, and I really hate to stop the conversation, because I think we could probably talk for quite some time more. But I want to just give you all a chance. I'm going to have to limit you to 1 sentence, 2 sentences, if possible. Just what would be your takeaway message that you want to leave us with? And Emma, I'm going to, as you were speaking last, I'll throw this to you first.
Yeah, I think I'll come back to, you can have the best technology in the world, you can have the best design in the world. It's all about people building that trustworthiness between people, and it's through people that this happens. And let's not forget that. Let's keep talking, let's keep discussing. Thanks.
Amen. Felix, and then I'm going to let Julian have the very last word.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm going to have 2 sentences, because my first sentence would just be apologising to Julian for giving him such a hard time today. But I have to say, I'm less unconfident in the IDS than I was an hour and a half ago, and I actually have to say thank you to Julian, because we've had much more useful information in the last hour and a half than I've had over the last 18 months in conversations with IDS teams. So that's been really useful. I still think you need to really get this user model, data model, whole issue sorted out and separated job issues. But I think we've got lots of useful stuff today, and maybe we can carry on afterwards and talk about things. So thank you.
Thanks, Felix.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
I want to thank Felix for pushing me so hard today. I think that's really good. As an economist, I always like a bit of competition in anything we're doing. And I didn't touch on the funding model, but I actually think you're right. And there are quite a lot of other things out there that are funded. I don't think the IDS is the one and only. And that ecosystem is really something we need to think about and talk about. We didn't have time today. My final point, though, Deborah, will be, look, huge amounts of value for people throughout this country, from getting the insights, from linking up data to improve money we're already spending on supporting them, trying to make their lives better. And that's really what this is all about. How do we improve people's lives? Loads of other things around it, but that's the core of it. And that's what the SRS has been doing for 20 odd years, ADR UK has been doing, and I hope the IDS is starting to do now to take that banner forward.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, what a fabulous discussion. I've really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. From a very selfish point of view, for indulging my interests. But I hope everybody else has found that really interesting as well. And thank you for giving up your precious time, because I know you're all super busy. So very happy to meet some of you that I've not met before, and I look forward to keeping an eye on what's happening back over in the UK from my little part of Germany. So a couple of really tiny housekeeping bits in 2 seconds. One, we don't want this to be a standalone seminar. We would like there to be additional discussions. We have some ideas about what we want to talk about, but we're interested in obviously what other people want us to talk about. So I've put my email in the chat. Please feel free to bombard me with ideas, and we will see what we can do over the coming months. The second thing, just a little plug for anybody who uses trusted research environments. There is a link to a survey for the ESRC. If anybody is a user and wants to give their opinions, please go over to the surveys. Yes, we got away from the culture issue a little bit, Felix. Maybe we need to have round 2. I don't know, let's see. But I'm going to wrap up there because, it's Friday afternoon for me. It's nearly time to finish. So I'm going to say a huge thank you to Emma, to Julian, to Felix for coming along and having such an open discussion. Thank you for all of our participants for coming and listening along, and we look forward to welcoming you all to another session soon, I hope. Enjoy your weekends.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Deborah.
you. Okay.
Bye.